Ooh. Hi there. Welcome, everybody, to CMS Philly and Multilingual Web Accessibility. Welcome to this Friday morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it is in your time zone. My name is Aimee Hannaford. I'm a certified professional of web accessibility and a bunch of other letters. I was the Hook 42 CEO and principal architect at Hook 42. And I'm here to talk about multilingual web accessibility. So just a bit of setting expectations. So it's pretty crazy how everything has been impacted. So be patient and kind. This session has a really generic design. I kept it simple. It's not completely prepared for accessibility, but we've provided the slides for review later, and it's pretty straightforward. And the slides are attached to this session. And this still has a lot of substance. So I'm going to cover a lot of topics, a lot of activities here. So please do ask questions. I have the question kind of area open, and I can be able to respond to those pretty easily. So as I go through this conversation, when I say multilingual, I'll be using ML to be representing multilingual, and accessibility, I'll do A11Y. In general, they're both big, complex topics, and so to squish them in one session is kind of entertaining. But combining the two within your workspace and within your websites also increases complexity to your workflow and to your technology. So we're going to cover them in big concepts and assume that everybody has some collective accessibility knowledge. I hope so. But if not, just come along for the ride. You'll be able to pick this up along the way. So. Also, I'm going to make some assumptions. I'm assuming that everybody follows the best practices and standards when you develop your website, whether it be Drupal or WordPress or Craft, whatever CMS that you're using, that you're having skilled team members that will perform the work. So do they have skills in multilingual? Do they have skills in accessibility? And maybe both. So, and that specialist for each organization and technology, like architect, for each organization and technology, will architect the most viable solution for your own personal organization's needs. And I have to say that pretty strongly because everybody's needs are different, although you can follow a lot of best practices along the way. And the session is for information only and does not represent any legal or professional advice from me. That's my lawyer tells me to put that there. So let's make sure that we gain understanding. I have a 3.5-year-old, and you guys might hear that and a meowing cat. So welcome to the COVID Chronicles and happy Friday. Today we will surface concepts, considerations, and challenges on these topics. So to get there, we're going to talk about some mutual considerations of multilingual and accessibility, an overview of how you can implement multilingual websites, like a quick overview. And then we're going to highlight some language-specific, accessibility-specific needs. So where is that Venn diagram kind of coming together between multilingual and accessibility? And then you get these challenges of compliance when you have to be compliant for both systems. And then we'll talk a little bit about impact to processes and workflow. I'm not going to be able to answer I will be able to answer your questions, but I'm not going to be able to give you a magic bullet of like, hey, this is going to be how you perfectly do it. This is just to open up conversation and questions you should take when applying these two topics to your own environment. So some mutual considerations of multilingual and accessibility are the big ones: legal considerations, design, development, comprehension, which is a fun one, testing, and then the workflow. So on the legal side, a lot, as you guys probably already know, there is a lot of legal requirements to be accessibly compliant. So if you're government agencies, higher education, industry, anything that's providing essential services, and many international laws require the use require that your website be accessible to everyone. And then most use the WCAG 2.0 as a standard as their baseline of accessibility compliance. As for multilingual requirements, sometimes you're going to be in an industry vertical, like healthcare. It will need to have a certain level of government support, like if you have a defense contract or whatever, and you're influenced by Spanish, like a population number. So, for example, we have a high level of Spanish speakers in California. So once we tipped a certain scale in California, hey, like you're in a healthcare insurance provider that you have to also serve government public folks, you now have to reach, you translate your site into Spanish very quickly. I did this for HealthNet many years ago. It was like, oh no, like all of a sudden there's a tipping point of the Spanish speaking population. We had to get the website translated and implemented very, very quickly. So that was many years ago, and it was not in Drupal, but that's okay. It's the same problem on any CMS. And then there's countries that have multiple official languages. So you have to have your site in many languages. So also there's design is another time where a lot of this mutual considerations in layout and structure and your negative space, the space between components on the screen, also reflow. How are your text flowing over when you're in different viewports, and what does it look like when you're zooming in? That is wonderful for accessibility, but also for multilingual. Also, which font are you using? So selection, the size, the color. When you're working with media, you have text in your images. If you have alternate text with that, if you're using any video, audio, or infographics, anything that has a bunch of words and conveyed meaning through imagery, that you may need a text-based alternative, but you also have to translate those things too. And that impacts workflow and testing and everything. And then also navigation. So your menus, your informative blocks, your heading structures, all of those you have to take care of in a really accessible focused design, but also in multilingual as well. When you get into the development area, for both multilingual and accessible sites, a good use of semantic HTML, it's good for everyone, right? It just makes an easier site to read and process by the browsers and any accessible tech. It also makes it easy to use for some translation plugins and that type of thing. Both systems use specialized markup to surface text strings. So I don't know if anybody has heard of ARIA label or described by any of the ARIA text, or we've all heard of alt text, right? Both of these use specialized markup to surface text strings, either to the translation management system or to the or to a person navigating through the page. And they both require additional technology configurations, libraries, and possible integrations. So Drupal or WordPress, yeah, it has multilingual support out of the box, kind of, but you need to configure it. You need to configure it for your language. You need to choose which things need to be translated. But then you also have to integrate it to a multilingual translation systems. But then you also have to configure your website for additional accessibility considerations like error management and that type of thing. Both topics and both specializations require additional training and skills. So you can absolutely jump into the deep end, I guess, if you will, with multilingual and accessibility, but it's going to take a while to ramp up to make sure they're both done in a comprehensive and correct method for your website. And because a lot of these things are legally compliant, you need to make sure that they're done absolutely in a correct, compliant manner. Both require specific testing tools, including manual tests. So it's not just, you can scan a site for multilingual, but multilingual has comprehension needs and that type of thing. And the same thing as accessibility. A lot of the accessibility things is beyond just the code. It's comprehension. It's what is the content editors doing? It's a lot of different things. And it's a lot of different tests that you have to do on a device-specific type of work. And both of them require full coverage and best practices adherence. You can't cut corners for either of them, because then you will have deficiencies in your implementations. Comprehension is a huge thing. So huge for accessibility because a big type of the POUR principle is making sure that people can understand what you're talking about. And it's the same thing for multilingual. Like if I make some words and copy in English, I can't sometimes just directly translate it because maybe I am usually using a lot of colloquialisms or like locale specific slang. And if I put that through Google Translate, it might not convey the same comprehension as the source language in the destination language. So you want to work using plain language content in all languages, not just the source ones. You want to make sure that your content reading level is to a point of that's going to service the most people that your website is servicing, and also the really focused one. Also, the content structure, we talked a lot about that headings, but also the paragraph structure and the sentence structure that gets more complex as you take in multilingual and true language, like beyond the English language requirements. Also, like content structure. So if you're dealing with tabular data, like tables, that type of thing, or diagrams and charts, all of these things come together in both translated and multilingual support and accessibility support. And then also, how are you delivering your language, right? Is it visually? Like, can you read or can you hear it? So can you see what the web page is saying? Is your screen reader going to read it? Is your haptic feedback, your Braille systems, are they going to provide the correct feedback as it goes through your website? So it's interesting. This level of comprehension is something that's like such a huge thing, but it can get overlooked easily when you're combining the two. Also, testing. Each uses very specific tools. Each has manual testing because you can run sites through some machine translation and go, okay, I'm going to hope that makes sense. But it can really fail when you test it. And so you have to have a human level of comprehension. It's the same thing for accessibility. And then sometimes you need very specific user testing. Like, do you need a low site Brazilian Portuguese tester in your workflow? Wow, that means you could need to go regionally find a low site Brazilian Portuguese tester, possibly. And also, test coverage. What are you testing? Is it comprehensive enough? Do you need to do it through multiple languages and through multiple workflow scenarios on your site and everything? It's interesting. And then also the testing process itself. There's these nice tools that can scan your site to get coverage, but is it going to catch when you're missing a translated tool or word? Is it going to get the wrong spelling errors because it doesn't have a dictionary, or it's only working off of an English dictionary? So there's all sorts of subtleties around testing that you have to consider. And then there's this last thing is the validation and proof of compliance. So it's not just did you test and have you surfaced things to rectify and remediate, but can you prove it to somebody else, like a legal compliance organization that maybe somebody has brought a lawsuit to you? Can you prove what level of compliance you are? And do you have data in the background? So it's all wrapped in this testing. And then that directly feeds into workflows. So this is like, when do you create content where, and both of them have a very interesting overlap too, because it's not just how are you creating that content. It's just you need to make sure that the content at the very beginning is accessible, and it's structured in an accessible and comprehensive way, but it also is reviewed and validated maybe before it goes off to the translation process, because that costs money to do that. And then you have to figure out how are you going to deploy this content. Is it deployed all at once for every languages? Is it a rolling effect? What are your legal requirements across the different areas? And then you have to take into consideration the end-to-end time to market of what you need for your website. So lots of stuff that come into play for accessibility and for multilingual. And they just kind of compound when you have to do them both at the same time. So when we're going to talk directly about multilingual websites, there's some really specific things that you need to take in consideration. So here's a little Drupal guy. we talked a little bit about multilingual design, but also page rendering, development, and content process. We touched on that, but let's get in a little bit deeper. So in multilingual design considerations, if you need to support a right-to-left layout, you must actually design for that and test for that. And you have to test for that in accessibility as well. So if you have to support Arabic, in addition to English, now you have a whole other round of testing for your accessibility to make sure, I can get through each one of this, tabbed-based navigation, not only on the left to right layout, but the right to left. You're like, wow, that just doubled all of my testing right there. Whoops. And wow, that can be a big impact. Also, when you use long words and symbols in content elements, you need to make sure, like, hey, is it a short word in English, but is it very long in German or Russian? Also, when you use text and images via, non-SVG, so if you actually, in Photoshop are typing text, how are you going to supply another image that has the correct language and that fits and it's accessible with a different coloring and stuff? But also then there's these other supporting texts such as labels and menus and that type of thing, and also SVGs. If you're embedding text within the SVG, how are you going to translate that? How is that workflow looking like? So there's all sorts of interesting challenges. And not only that, it's like you have to make sure you take those into consideration very early. And this is with accessibility, you'd have to do that early with your design too, so you don't have to go back and re-architect anything in the if you run into issues. So if you have to have multilingual and accessibility together, you have to do those both together very early to make sure you can get ahead of anything that might cause a problem later. So the interesting thing about multilingual pages, there's like two big types that you can do. One of is like native page rendering. The languages are rendered directly from the website. You're like, wait, doesn't everything do that? Sure, kind of, but not really. So some examples are like the Drupal core language. And if you have Adobe AEM, it's native support there. WordPress native support. WordPress extended support. But also you can have hard-coded HTML or the HTML output that's rendered by your CMS. And this method is often integrated with a third-party translation management system, like TMS, to provide the translations and the translation workflow, and it feeds it back into your rendering system, and that rendering system takes care of all of the languages up. So that is one big way. Another big way that people use is a proxy-based system. And I don't know if anybody's heard of that. Google Translate, that little widget, I'll show you in a second. But translations are added with a JavaScript overlay, and they're served from a translation management system on real time, right? So it's a live proxy, so it sits on top of what's going on. So Google Translate widget is a good example of this, or the Chrome plugin is. We could have paid software services like TransFX or the SmartLink Global Delivery Network and the SDL proxy. Now, some proxies require additional development to support decoupled sites. So that's kind of an interesting thing. And some actually require special text in your code to surface strings to be proxied. So that one's an interesting one because you're like, okay, if you're real-time rendering that for me, what about all the hidden text, like my ARIA labels, or am I described by? How does it get picked up? Does it get picked up? That type of thing. And that's what you need to take into consideration in your overall web architecture and your content workflow architecture. So here's the peek at the Google Translate widget. The website plugin is no longer supported, so you can still use it, but Google has stopped truly officially supporting it. So some conjecture is like the quality of the machine translations are reduced by overuse and not contributing back quality ones, and that type of thing. There's a lot of reasons why they probably stopped it, but at the user level, you can use the Google Chrome Translate plugin instead, but it doesn't provide this like native on the server, hey, I can translate this page, which a lot of websites are using. So I'm going to give you an example of this. Here's the Sonoma County. Sonoma is near where I live. Here's a nice little sample of a Google Translate. So probably everybody's familiar with this at some point, and it fulfills the requirement of having a government supported, funded website that can support multiple different languages. It just does it by the Google Translate button. But what is the quality of that type of thing that comes into play, and that's what you have to take into consideration of your own organization. This site just a couple of weeks ago had a nice slideshow that had a really good example of an image with text in it, but then they also did a Spanish version right next to it in the slideshow, so you could see very quickly, the way they got around, hey, the hours are changing for the COVID stuff was, hey, I'm going to throw just one English-specific slide and one, Spanish-specific slide, because they wanted to surface that as best they can to their site. So you can still install the Google Website Translate widget. So here's let me Google that for you, samples of all these different blogs that you can actually find that code and still use it, but at any point it can just get shut off. And if you have a site that's really, really requiring compliance, then you should consider being a little bit more conservative with that. So I have hidden behind here. I'll get in here in a second. Okay. And then development considerations, you have to be mindful when you're embedding text strings in code. You have to do that so you can surface the code to be either translatable through your CMS for your content editors and translation team, or you need to have it be able to send out to the translation management system. It's a big deal because a lot of times people will scratch their heads going like, how can I change that text? And it's like coded somewhere in like a hard-coded string. And then the other type of thing is like, part of accessibility is making sure that the text is comprehensive or comprehensible. So if they need to go back and change that text to be more accessible, then they need to figure that out, regardless if it's multilingual as well. Also, you need to make sure that the explicit language, the language you're working on is on the page or in sections if you have like multiple languages on a single page. Forms, you have to make sure that you consider in development considerations because both native and third-party integration. So I'm going to talk about like Drupal has web form, and that's native. There's form API, and there's fields, and there's field error messages and descriptive text. Those all things need to be translated. But then there's also this like, oh, cool, I'm going to integrate with a CRM system. So I'm gonna tie in some Pardot or some Eloqua thing. Now, then that gets more complex because you're like, wait, that I'm sucking that form in with an iframe. Does that have all the multilingual considerations? Do I have to have a form per language? Does it know what language to switch? How that's more challenging. So you're like, oh yeah, that one more level of moving part is interesting. And also, hey, this person's coming in from a Spanish site. Do I need some magic form marking to say I'm coming in from a Spanish-speaking site? So I need to know to be funneled to maybe the Spanish-speaking, surface folks that need help out. And then once again, all of that hidden and less obvious content like page metadata, the open graph information, the social media integrations, hreflang, your URL structures, and your URL transliterations, everything like that, you need to make sure that's coming into play. And this also drives directly to the comprehensibility in accessibility. So, this is interesting. So the multilingual content workflow here is that the source content must be final for translation. That means at some point, because humans and professionals need to translate this, it costs money per word to do that. And this machine translation helps decrease the cost of it, but it really can cause issues with content comprehension. So, and this is where translations commonly take place in a translation management system, and they may have limited context of where you're using words. So if you've got this weird code that's piping up a word or a button or something somewhere, and there's no idea where the translator understands where that's showing up. They don't know how to actually translate that in a way to fit on the screen and to be comprehensive, to be like comprehensive, sure. Blah. It's Friday. I had enough coffee. I hope you guys are laughing. Let's all laugh for a second. Anyway, you just have to take that into consideration. And then there's so many people on the multilingual team. So you've got your project manager, your client, but then there's like the translation team managers and those like account managers and the localization teams and the CMS specialists and developers, and then the content team and the media specialists. So many people are involved. That adds layers of coordination and complexity to your workflow. And just in general, the developers, you'll give the source to folks, and then like the managers will be like, hey, can you guys translate this? And then the reviewers will be doing manual testing. This is a very high level, simple thing, but it is this workflow that's cyclical. And at what point do you deploy out? When is it done and when is it acceptable and compliant? And that comes into play, interestingly, with accessibility. Like, when are we going to test it? When is it accessible as well? Which comes into accessibility language considerations. So we're going to talk about some coverage, some accessible technology, and then some very specific WCAG success criteria around language. So first of all, you need to identify your needs, both the legal and business needs, about accessibility laws in the regions that you're supporting and the languages. Identify the people that are working on it and the process, and balance the process within your org constraints of budget, of tooling, of that type of thing, and skills, right? And the biggest challenges here is there are so many testing steps and test case permutations when you combine the tool. And then also, what's interesting is people forget, like, editorial content. It can be a huge source of accessibility compliance issues. Now, that's because you're like, oh, cool, I've got like my navigations filled out, and I've got all my like headers and footers taken care of, and I've got all this other stuff. But if somebody is going to write in such a way that doesn't have all the information, or the alt text isn't correct, and all sorts of things, that editorial content can cause a page to be non-compliant. So the biggest hard thing here is making sure everybody knows how to create good and accessible editorial content. And that actually helps feed the multilingual translation process. So it's interesting. So multilingual accessible technology, native operating system have different languages it's supported. And there's a lot of text-to-speech things that are the synthesizers that are in the OSs, and then additional synthesizers, and those are used by things like screen readers. Now, Braille is not a language. Braille is a way to convey. It's. Let me see here. I wrote it in my notes, and I can't go out of presenter mode. So if you guys just hold tight, I will search this. Braille is not a language. It's a writing system. And it's created based on the French, like Western ASCII language, and it's really phonetic. The dots that Braille has, like the haptic touch, they're phonetic sounds. So Braille dots are closest to phonetic sounds of what you're hearing. And so German has a slightly different modified usage, but it matches the phonetic sounds. So Braille's not a language; it's a how to feel what the sound is. Does that sound? So you don't necessarily have to. So the refreshable Braille displays will work with your native operating system and your web page language, and it will be able to feed that through. But that's one of the fun accessible text that's like, oh, it's not really speaking to me, but it's phonetically projecting what the letters are. Now, the challenge is accessible technology requires semantic HTML to function correctly. And that language coverage differs across different technologies. So your iOS tools, which screen reader you're using, which operating system you're using, and that type of thing. So, So here's multilingual design. Very specifically for WCAG, you need to make sure that the reflows, text wrapping, spacing of the text, resizing of the page, fonts and text size, all are really taken into consideration. If you have text-based buttons, consider the size and functionality, because sometimes they're very big or sometimes they're small. Also, clear representation of your language switcher, because some people will just have a flag or a language code, but that might not be enough to understand which language to switch from. Also, we talked about images of text, comes in from logos, or also if you're using images of text for navigation, you shouldn't be doing that very often unless you have a lot of special markup to help that go through. But this requires accessibility design testing across languages, especially like key workflows and key useful things. Like if you know French is very similar to English or Spanish, then you're like, okay, let's use a couple of these as a test case. But then you have to throw in, here's Chinese, and here's German, and here's a Russian with Cyrillic. Like you have to throw in those other types of language and different byte characters to see what it's going to look like, and is it accessible across those areas. And also, this is where you need to really take a look at, oh, my cat's crying again. You take a look at your media approach, right? So are you using a digital asset management system? Where are your team translating that information? Where does the alt text get put in and that type of thing? This also happens of where are you making your closed captions and all sorts of stuff. Okay, I'm just time checking. Okay, so WCAG, you need to identify language and code. And so you can have language of the page here. So HTML lang equals EN, or you can have language of parts. So this is where, for example, in California, the Department of Motor Vehicles has this one page that has like all these different languages that says, get the user manual in Russian. And it's one page from their English site, but here's a section that says Russian and section that's in Tagalog. And they have all these different sections that point to their very specific driver's, guide in the language. This would be a good place where you would have language of parts on a page. You have an English site with a page that has language in it. So that's a subtle thing a lot of people miss out here. So, but the challenges here, you need to have some website and CMS configuration required to support these things correctly. And then in-page content, like editor tools, you have to get the training for your editor team, and these TMS processes need to be able to understand, oh, I am an English page, but I'm coming in with French embedded in it. Oh, I need to know to not translate that again. I need to know that it's not English on a page. Lots of complexities because those systems go, oh, hey, thanks, I see you're bringing an English page in. I need to process it into my, destination language like French or German. But if you say you're an English page and you have a section that's French without saying that it's French, then that TMS is going to be like, okay, you say that's English. I think that's English. And then it can muck up your translation source and destination history. So it gets a bit challenging. So. Here, success criteria that has any translatable text. This is all the non-text alternatives. So if you have a big infographic, do you have a non-text alternative for it, or a very complex like table and that type of thing? Also errors, labels, messages, the hidden text that pops up when you totally need to do it, but when you least expect it. Audio descriptions, closed captions, sign language. That's a AAA live one, but if you need to have sign language that's in a different language, sign language, then you have to account for that somewhere on your site. So some of the challenges here is the CMS display. So you have to make sure are you rendering translated versions of your content? Is it, if something's embedded, is it matching that content source? And also the workflow, how do you surface that information to translate in context? Then how do you test it? At the end-to-end test to say, oh yeah, that error message is coming up correctly in French and it makes sense and it's accessible, that type of thing. And then all these published language variants. it's hard enough on one language, so it just adds more things to track. So some challenges with compliance. Is compliance a choice or a requirement? And, if it's a choice, I air quote choice, because there's more and more need for compliant websites, and there's more lawsuits against people for websites these days. So choice is interesting, but you can increase your market reach if you make a more multilingual and accessible website. But it's also the greater good, so your information is shared more across, not only for people that have different requirements for comprehension, but also in different languages. And so if it's a requirement, though, this is where we talked about before, are you a municipal? Are you a city? Are you a state? Are you federal? Do you receive funding that drives a requirement for accessible work? Are you an essential service? Now, we all know what that word means these days, but because it's a real active word. But, before that, what really is an essential service? And then also, do you have a lot of do you have a lot of ESL folks? Are there groups of your regions as English as a second language area? There are a lot of laws. There's a language access laws is what it is. You can take a look at it, and it's driven at different municipalities and stuff. And there's very many levels of compliance and legality that start, region, city, state, federal, country. So as you look at it, you have to look at it in many various lenses to make sure that you're truly compliant. It's really hard with compliance is like proving it, right? So if somebody's coming here and said, your website isn't accessible and that type of thing, how do you prove it? So for one of those ways to prove it is to have tools to help you prove what things are. For example, like if you wanted to say, hey, I have this nice site that the readability is accessible, it's usable, it's like 9th grade requirement, everything's okay, the reading level is clear. Well, a lot of those tools don't exist for non-English languages because readability is something that's a complexity of how many words used, how many syllables, and that type of thing. And that gives reading level and comprehension level. A lot of those don't exist in other languages, or you have to find a different tool that's going to give that same level of like readability testing. There can be a lot of false negatives, like we talked about spell checking and like, hey, if you just have an English dictionary, it's really going to find a lot of issue with French or Spanish, right? So proof of compliance comes with manual testing. There's a neat trusted tester system from the Department of Health Services, but there's also other manual testing that you can do, and that's either accessibility or comprehension on multilingual. And then there's, how do you quantify this? How do you quantify compliance? Like, oh, I started with a B or a D, and now I'm at a B. If you talk about like grade level type of thing, how do you do that? And this is where you need to have a set group of tests and a set group of passing criteria and a set way to say pass versus fail. That's where this trusted tester program comes in from the DHS. It's really quite interesting too, so you can take a look at that. Also, you can use tools like the Lighthouse Axe plugins. You can use things like Site Improve or all sorts of other different site scanner tooling. The cost and compliance is really defined by how much to test and when. When do you do translated content accessibility tests? How much is it automatic? How much is manual? How often? Do you go in and say, oh yeah, my whole header and footer and everything else seems like it's passing tests, and do you just test content? I don't know. It all depends on your organization's requirements. And also, where and when do these people have availability to test? right? And this is when you have to take into the cost of compliance is multiple compliance requirements for like accessibility and the language access laws. Now, this is where a lot of business folks, if they don't know that complexity of both of those together, it costs money and people don't forget to budget it. But you know what? It costs a lot more to have a lawsuit called against you because you're still going to need to be compliant after that anyway, and you're going to pay a lot of fees. So it's like, where do you want to mitigate your internal risks and costs? So that's a big type of thing coming on. Here, I see a question that popped up, so I just saw it. Oh, can you give examples of a digital content management system? Oh, yeah, I'll do that at the end. Thanks. That's great. Because this it'll tie in right with this section. So there's a workflow impact, a big one, right? Because there's common workflows in either accessibility or multilingual. But the first one is like, let's just assume it's a multilingual workflow. I'm going to write the first source content. Do you do the accessibility test on your first source content? Do you do it just for the content or the whole page or the whole technology and the whole system? Then you need to make sure that the translation content workflow is clear. So this is where you're like, hey, I need to tell the people doing professional translation of my content to Spanish, I need to train them what accessible content is, right? Or do we say, oh, a good source is maybe probably going to guarantee a good translation? That comes into kind of knowing who your professional translators are or your translation services. So then also there's localization, and localization is different than translation. Translation is just like one-to-one. Here is one, here's the other. Localization is like, oh, I'm going to make this page slightly different for my Russian market versus my Tagalog market. So that means it's like not just carrying over words, but you have to, then there's new original content in that area. So now your localization team is like, needs to know how to do accessible content. So it's kind of crazy, right? Like, here's more complexity. Who else do I need to train, right? How do I test it and where? And then there's content-specific success criteria, right? So this is like very specific, like alt text is specifically used in here, that type of thing. And then specialized content workflows, like here's your digital asset management system or other processes. Like when I say a web process, it's like, oh, this is the checkout process, is a specialized content workflow, or any API integrations. You know, those are very specific. Now I'll bring up the digital asset management question. So, this is the old name to it, but it's like Adobe Scene 7 is like a live content management system. There's a whole bunch of different ones. One second. And of course, I'm just brain lagging. Digital asset management systems. Drupal was kind of like a digital asset management system where you can put like one image in and resize it. So you can kind of see what that's. But let me get the big names because there is a few ones. Like I've worked with a bunch of them, but then they have so many new ones coming out. I think a big one, Acquia Dam is out there. Like, so I don't know who's doing Drupal specific type of work, but there's a bunch of things. So here, one of them is like, see, I've used Binder. Binder is pretty cool. So basically what a digital asset management is you put like the original kind of digital assets in big original Photoshops, that type of thing. And you tag it with specific metadata. And then you have a bunch of rules around this that will say, oh, if I have the source and it's big, I want to render the web version like this, and maybe the one for print like this. And then you put them in different structures and you can find it. Like I worked very heavily with one that's a little bit older called Media Bin from Interwoven in times past. But it's great. It's how do you find all your images so you don't have, this tons of duplicates of the same picture, but then you can also track if you need to give like rights to each digital asset, then you make sure that they're all tucked in this digital asset management system. So the advantages there is you can use it one DAM over lots of different CMSs. It feeds the website. The trickery around this is, okay, do you put alt text on, do you put some alt text around that digital asset in the DAM, or do you wait until you get into Drupal or WordPress or within a specific page to do that alt text? If it has specific text inside the imagery, like where do you do it? Where do you translate it? And do you say, is it translated, or do you just say that this is my manual that's English or my manual that's Italian? So it's interesting because it's not just this like image, but it's also can be your PDFs and that type of thing. So this is a big deal coming into anything that has like, manuals that you need, sewing machines, any type of like computer type of work. So anyway, I hope that answers the question, but that was a really good question. Thank you. And then the other common workflow is this content publication lifecycle. It's like proof of public access. This is a big deal sometimes when you have to prove to another organization, what did my site look like on this day at 4 p.m. And if you need to go make something published live, do you have to do it in all languages at once, or do you have to do it in a rolling way? It all depends. There's a lot of different companies I've worked with have many different content workflows if they're like a medical device company or other types of things. So it's very interesting. So it's dependent on what you're talking about. And then this is where you have to look at that internally of when do you add accessibility? When do you add multilingual to accessibility, right? Who do you train? Who is testing? When do you test? And what are you testing? Some really external considerations are translations happen outside the CMS and return to the website. Professional translators can change without control if you're having a service do it. And then also, how do the third-party integrated systems support multilingual and accessibility, right? Because just because you're integrating with a third-party system and you're sucking in an iframe doesn't mean that you are not liable for that content. You're sucking in that content on your site. So you are liable because it's part of your site. It's very interesting. So also, the last thing you can do is perform audits. Or the first thing you should do is perform audits, actually. So professionally, I've been doing large enterprise tech process and multilingual audits for over 25 years. Accessibility audits specifically for 4 years. Multilingual, it's like you have to do audits on all different levels, right? And you have to find a baseline of your success or your, room for improvement, right? So for audits, for the multilingual, you do that when you prepare for translation or translation configurations or adding another language. And then you make sure you get the most efficient translation process. And for accessibility, you tie the comprehensive testing into the overall process. And you can use our audits as a starting point to confirm your baseline of requirement. Because if you're really super non-compliant, then you're going to get there and you'll just add complexity with multiple languages and stuff. So I see we have 1 more minute. This is the Accessible Multilingual team has more people. There's accessibility governance, testers, and accessibility testing tools. And the question, this one is, if you translate terms and conditions into multiple languages, are they all legally binding? And that is interesting. I am not a lawyer. I cannot answer that. So, but if you translate your terms and conditions, they are understood. And I will give you a quick look-see here. I know we're right at the end, but I went to the Nike site because it's kind of neat and it's pretty, and you can see. I did work on some of the Nike stuff years past, but you can see here is German. Here's a Great Britain site. It looks different. This has been localized, right? You can see that the text, they've actually gotten a pretty good text, but like a lot of the wording might be longer. Here, let's get in. See, look at that. Just on to main, this one. What tool has been used for audit? Now, Lee, that was, there's many different types of tools. I did some presentations for like which accessibility tools are right for you, some past DrupalCons, so you can take a look at those. Because tooling is huge. I do manual multilingual audits, and Hook 42 still is actually the folks that do audits for Lingotech for the new folks coming in. So we take a look at their site. So we have a fleet of in-house tools that we use to comprehensively audit. And also the audit needs to be done by people who know what's happening. So a huge part, just because we have tools that assist it, you have to have that skill to know, like, oh, what I see looks wrong. Or it looks really right, or to know what that remediation. Is that helpful, Lee? Is that good? Okay, sorry. But I think that's good. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye, hun. Bye.